And welcome to the Self-Aware Entrepreneur Show. Thank you for joining us on this wonderful sunny Monday. Depending on where you are in the world, it might be sunny. The sun might still be coming up. And the beauty is today that I've managed to get another international guest on, the one and only Sam Miller, tuning in all the way from Toronto in Ontario in Canada. And Sam is one of the biggest fans of the show, I've got to say. But more than anything, he's got so much to bring that we're not going to be able to fit it all in half an hour. So you're going to have to tune in for the longer form podcast. That'll be out later in the autumn. But Sam, I mean, he's been a psychotherapist for over 25 years. He's incredibly knowledgeable on so many different aspects, from PTSD through to trauma, and really understanding how that impacts first responders, people in positions who've been in conflict, and really, appreciating and understanding some of the challenges that happen at moment of crisis and how that impacts people in the longer term. But as well as that, he's got, a lot of understanding of how that relates into business, looking at organizational resilience, psychosocial risk, and really how organizations can look at the psychological aspects of stress, of change, of conflict, and really building structures to ensure that when that does inevitably happen, because it's only, human, and it's accepting that as a business, it's not always this upward trajectory, and it's not always that everything runs seamlessly, but actually building businesses that have the ability to really thrive even in the most challenging circumstances. So, Sam, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to the show today.
Thank you, Lee. And it's been a long time coming, and I'm glad we were able to, frankly, I was glad I was able to wake up this early and join you. But thank you for that opportunity. It truly has been a difficult and interesting time, this time of the pandemic, for individuals, as you stated, but very much so for businesses, and how we define what the workplace exists, what that means, working remotely, creating an atmosphere of team in remote situations, and dealing with the difficulties and the traumas that have been what the pandemic has represented to us.
Yeah, so much so. And obviously, you're tuning in on Eastern time, which means that it's really, really early. But you know what? That from a neuroscience perspective, you are absolutely fresh to give us your best insights right now. So yeah, Sam, can you tell us a little bit about what you've been up to this past 12 months, obviously being really skilled across a variety of modalities in managing change, given there's been so much change?
Thank you. It has been a interesting / difficult time for me, like it has been for many people. A lot of the work I do is face to face, whether I'm giving workshops on various mental health topics and workplace mental health and wellness topics, whether I am doing psychotherapy with my clients, or I'm responding to a trauma in the workplace. All of that went remote, and it went very quickly. And so for me, like many businesses, like many individuals, here's where life imitates art, so to speak. And my experience of my first 2 to 3 months was very difficult, because all the organizations that I consult to weren't getting business or were working internally to try and save work for their own people. So I had that adjustment piece like most people had. Once that came around, it was learning how to do the skills that I had, the psychotherapy, the trauma response even, and the webinars. I now can proudly say I am probably versed in most, if not all, of the platforms that we deliver, because out of necessity. And that truly has been what many people have tried to do with respect to the workplace. But it has been a really difficult time in the work that I do, because the individuals who pre-pandemic had mental health issues, this really just increased those, because what trauma does, or the definition of trauma, it's the ultimate stressor, and it's the ultimate sense of not having control. And what the pandemic did for us in the stages, and it's frankly still doing that, we're in a lockdown, we're out of lockdown, and there's always that uncertainty, which is very difficult for many people with mental health issues. For those who didn't have any of that, this might have brought out some underlying tendencies or worries or mental health issues. So that's been a challenge for me as a therapist, as a workplace trauma specialist, on how to pivot from doing what I did face to face to doing it well virtually. But
Yeah.
not only that, and here's where I think it relates really well to business, is that I had to learn how to do some of my skills virtually, missing some of the nuances of psychotherapy, of trauma response, of even workshops. It's a lot different speaking to a screen for 4 hours versus being in an audience, getting the vibe back from the people you're talking to. So too with things like trauma and grief counseling, the normal ways we grieve. We don't have necessarily, we didn't have for a while, the ceremonial funerals, visitations for people to get some closure. And so you had to talk about that. And then all of that with that overlying stressor of pandemic and isolation for many people.
Yeah, and it's been a really challenging time. And like you say, you yourself have brought the skills that you've built over 30 years of career, and had to very agilely and very quickly adapt them to be able to deliver them virtually in a world where quite often your clients were looking at outwards and their needs were changing at the same time.
Yes.
So it's kind of bringing that knowledge that you have of how to manage change and manage crisis and applying it really on yourself, which is, an interesting case study, and it's really powerful. But what I want to dig into, Sam, is, pulling it all the way back to your very early career. Tell us a little bit more about the story and the journey that brought you to do the work you do today.
Wow. Okay. I started off as a psychotherapist, went to graduate school, and very early on in my career, I did a lot of work I actually, for the first few years of my career, worked in schools as a psychoeducational consultant, working with children and learning disabilities. But that transitioned into do something called rehabilitation psychology, which is the psychology of individuals involved, in this particular case, predominantly people in either workplace accidents or motor vehicle accidents. And the whole issue of pain and pain management, and the individuals who never had trouble driving all of a sudden get into one accident, and now they cannot drive anymore. And the idea behind that is just you're introducing to your psyche that it will happen, or it can happen. Most times you get into the car, you're driving, you don't even think about it. Once that happens, it's and because of the intensity of the anxiety, of the trauma related, it now can prevent people from driving and from conducting activities of daily living, because they're stuck at home, or they're handicapped by not being able to be as mobile as they once were. That transitioned into something at the beginning of my career as it exists today, which is working for employee assistance providers. So in North America and in Europe as well, there's a concept of an employee assistance provider, which is an organization whose clients are companies. And so I would be the individual who would do psychotherapy, because that was offered as a benefit, as well as traumas and workshops. And for a period of time in one organization, I was in charge of all traumas and workshops for the province of Ontario. I did that for 5-6 years. I then went independent, not by choice. I was let go from the organization. And it's a difficult time, but when we talk about experience and richness of experience, now one of the things I do as a trauma responder is what we call termination support. And I can not only empathize with people, but I can actually say, I know where you've been and how you might react. And so and that's pretty much led me to where I am now. I do a lot of work with employee assistance providers, either delivering, developing workshops on various work-related workshops, and they're taking mental health and wellness concepts and applying them to the workplace. But the reality is you can generalize those concepts to your non-work life. And I became a trauma responder, so going on site to organizations when there's a sudden death, or working with transit workers when they're the subway driver who unfortunately was driving the subway when someone committed suicide, and different types of aviation accidents, terrorist issues and accidents, and I've done that, and I have a small independent practice as well. But interestingly, one thing that the pandemic has done for me is it's caused me to pivot a little bit away from that and to be doing more and more work on my own. Hence LinkedIn, hence our connection, and that's where I am today. But it has been a very interesting 25 to 30 years of that, and it's constantly evolving, and there's constantly new challenges. A number of years ago, even though I've done work with trauma for many years, I officially became what's called an EMDR trauma therapist. So I'm certified in that modality, and I do cognitive behavioral therapy, some acceptance and commitment therapy as well. So various modalities as well. And often, especially in the trauma work I do, it's not one specific modality. It's because trauma is, you get there and you assess. And I'm also been fortunate to do some work with the government of Canada. They've developed an excellent program on mental health awareness in the workplace. So I deliver that for them as well. So that in a nutshell, and married with 5 children, 4 grandchildren along the way. So it's been an interesting 30 or so years.
Yeah, and you've managed to pick up so much experience and knowledge over that time. And if we kind of actually look at how, mental health, mental well-being in the workplace has changed over that time, it's seen a significant shift, especially over the past 5 years. So how have you really kind of brought together your expertise that you've picked up along the way, the industrial knowledge and experience of working within a range of different companies and responding to trauma in a number of different places, and your own lived experience of, living through that and some of the challenges that you faced? How do you blend them together to really deliver this, wide-ranging, ultimately therapeutic intervention that you do today?
So it's interesting because, as you say, there has been definitely a shift in terms of understanding and acceptance in the workplace of issues of mental health and wellness. Just to give you an example, when we talk about change and change management, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, I wouldn't have done many workshops on change management. But now, as those of us who work in managing change from an emotional and psychological and business perspective, understand that the only way you as an organization are going to be able to best manage your change is when you get the buy-in from your employees. And so it's not going to be as productive when you impose change as opposed to when you lead through change. And so that dynamic, that understanding has changed. I will tell you, there are still companies who call me out, and I do a 1 hour, 2 hour change management workshop, and that for them is their transparency with their organization. It really isn't, and ultimately it's not going to do its best. But when you have, and you are beginning to see more and more leaders and HR individuals who understand that, and so are bringing you in earlier on to manage change, and even in the areas of bullying and harassment and things of that. Most, if not all, organizations that I go to in the last few years all have policies around that process and how to deal with that. So the mindset is changing, most definitely, and the whole need to reduce the stigma associated with mental health is becoming more and more prevalent. And part of that is because there are individuals, and I'm not familiar with who that might be, but I'm sure there are many in the UK, just like there are in North America, celebrities, if you will, who have began to speak openly about the mental health challenges that they have experienced. And so that is enlightening in and of itself. We still sorely have a lot of work to do. And it's interesting. That's one of the directions that I am moving to, and we can get there at some point, where what my next steps are. But I'm extremely passionate about mental health awareness, and specifically reducing the stigma, because from my perspective, you want to create a healthy workplace, but we talk about health and safety all the time, but I'm
Mhm.
talking about psychological health and safety.
Yeah.
And psychological health and safety means really providing a comfort zone. So if I'm an individual with mental health challenges, I don't feel that if I open up to a manager, a colleague, that's going to affect my employment. It still
Yeah.
does, unfortunately, in some places, but that's the goal is. And if I may, if we put that together, with the push for diversity and inclusion,
Yeah.
you put those two together, you can create a really healthy workplace. The term I always like to use when I'm talking about diversity is, um, I'm not different than you. Because if I say I'm different than you, then I'm in one silo, you're in a separate silo. If I
Yeah.
say I'm different like you, that means we don't have to agree on everything.
Yeah.
I have some differences, you have your differences, but we respect those, and we
Yeah.
bring those into the work we do, and that leads to collaboration. Um, and there's much more buy-in to that
Yeah.
nowadays, and I think it's a much healthier environment. And maybe the pandemic has caused us to even shift there a little quicker than we might have.
Yeah. So, what do businesses need to consider when they're actually looking at fusing these aspects of well-being and diversity, equity, inclusion together to really generate that, organizational culture where people feel like they belong, like they're appreciated, where they can express themselves, and ultimately where they can be transparent about some of the challenges that they have?
So there are a number of issues. One fundamental issue is creating educational opportunities for your organization to understand mental health and
Yeah.
mental illness. Um, because part of the issue is stigma, and stigma is misconceptions, misunderstandings of mental health and mental illness. And so if you're trying to create an inclusive place, but you're through no fault of their own. I mean, we have over years developed, whether it's culturally, whether it's community wise, whether it's individual, we've developed biases. We
Yeah.
need to challenge those. And so fundamentally, a first step for me would be to understand what the culture of the organization is and create a culture of acceptance. And that is just educational initiatives around mental health, mental illness. And I will always say mental health with mental illness. I look at mental illness as a continuum
Yeah.
from healthy all the way to ill and back and forth. And the understanding of looking at it as a continuum that we can move back and forth on gives me the understanding that, yes, if someone is diagnosed with a mental illness, that allows them, just like any physical illness, frankly,
Yeah.
with the right support and medication if need be, they're right back into being healthy and contributing. So there needs to be an educational initiative to understand that. That's one.
Yeah.
Um, just from an overall employee perspective, you also have to create policies and processes within your organization that allows someone with mental illness to talk about it, to bring it forward, just like they would with any other disability,
Yeah.
right? Managers would not think twice or individuals would not think twice to take time off for any kind of physical, God forbid, a physical illness.
Yeah.
We need to have that same perspective on mental illness and an understanding. So when you put those two together, those I think really provide an opportunity for individuals who have mental illness to come forward. But there's always the understanding, and I always preach this very strongly, that if you're an individual, a manager, a colleague who wants to support or help a colleague with
Yeah.
mental illness, your role is as a colleague, as a manager. It's not as a psychotherapist, and that's not because I'm not, don't want competition. It's because the idea is that there's a tremendous value that you have as that friend, as that manager. To provide a safe spot,
Yeah.
understanding that even if you're concerned and you might approach someone who has mental health issues, they might not be ready yet,
Yeah.
and you've got to give people time. And there's a whole, I mean, I could spend hours and hours on how to communicate and support just around that, approaching someone or responding to someone with mental illness. But I think the other thing or the other two factors, if I may. One is employers need to understand that when you create that kind of environment, you're going to have a much better end product, because you're going to allow for creativity. Because the creative people, if they know they can take a chance and fail, and you have their back and they get up and they try again, it leads to tremendous, productivity. That's one. Two, and I'm finding this is switching, and this kind of leads to where I'm going with some of the stuff I'm doing. Often when I go out to a workplace to do a trauma response or give a webinar, sometimes the HR people aren't there or the executives aren't there. It's for everybody else. And you need to understand that no matter who you are affected.
Yes.
And you need to deal with it. And I'd rather deal with you proactively than reactively. When you're not coping, you're not dealing well.
Yeah. And I think it's, so often, even the ability to show that you are, also affected, that you are not, this figure above in the hierarchy, but you are also human, is actually incredibly powerful in transmitting, that fact that ultimately, you are also someone who is human, and that kind of human ability is something that's sometimes missing in the leadership space. And that, really kind of filters down to other people, and they don't feel like they belong, or they can bring their human being to work if their leadership is not congruently being human themselves and living and, breathing and ultimately acting by the values that they've set for the organization. Now, there is one thing that I just want to drop in quickly, Sam, is that from an experienced therapist point of view, there is a little bit of consternation in the industry about those who are very almost, like angelically positive about their type of therapy, the one modality that they've really focused on. And for yourself, you're an experienced therapist, but you've also taken, the elements of your psychotherapy and blended them with some of the CBC, some of the ACT, some of the EMDR. You've kind of widened that net, understanding that ultimately trauma is not a simple solution, problem fix. So tell us a little bit about what you think about that ability to dip into different modalities and pick the most usable and, important abilities to help people through that.
So for me as a therapist, and I have training in many different areas, for me as a therapist, the reason why I do that is to be a good therapist, you have to understand your client. One of the first things I say to any potential client is, if you don't feel comfortable with me, I don't want to be your therapist. There has to be that comfort level. So part of that is understanding about the individual, about the issue, what's going to work. Now, if I'm stuck in one modality, then I might not be able to help certain people. But by being more open to various modalities, that gives me more options. Now, that's not to say that there are certain modalities that work better for certain situations. For sure there are. Just my philosophy as a therapist has always been to have more tools in my toolbox so I can manage more situations. I can consult on more situations. That's just always been my philosophy in how I approach the work I do.
Yeah, and that again is kind of that ability as we kind of look to the future, we're having that diverse skill set to be able to utilize different aspects and really bring a richer value than just going down the very isolated path of becoming an expert in just one area, and finding that when you dip into your toolbox of skills, well, you have one big hammer, but no chisels for finer details.
Right.
And I think that's something that's really starting to come to the fore as people start to look at their own, toolkits and see, what have I managed to cultivate over these years, and how are they going to help me to make a positive impact going forward? So what I do want to know, Sam, is you've obviously alluded to that you've started to, chisel your own journey now and are really starting to hone your focus in a particular area. Now, we know that in the workplace, still an awful long way to go in really looking at how, organizations take psychosocial elements and start to move them forward. There's still a lot of, resistance and friction. Awareness has increased, but has it always followed with action and embedding and aspects that are actually starting to make a significant difference to employees? And over this past year, employee expectations have started to change. because people have adapted and acclimatized to working flexibly, working remotely, and have shown that as a precedent that they can do that, can be trusted. And there's almost like a view of reciprocation. Is the employee experience now going to be based on trust of the organization and the management and the leadership? So is that the area that you're going into, or is it something different, Sam?
So one of my, I would say, faults is I sometimes bite off more than I can chew and go in too many different areas. But I'll tell you, fundamentally, I'm continuing the work that I've done for 20 years because that's my base, and I continue to do that for many reasons. But I'm branching off into two areas. One is exactly the type of work that you talk about, redefining what the new workplace is like, education, awareness of individuals. So, and it kind of leads to being versed in a number of different therapies, because if I'm going to be working with workplaces, I'm going to be addressing a whole range of issues and individuals. So I need to be ready for that. But it's with respect to the work I do with workplaces, it's very much, I'm focusing now on leaders, and getting them to address their own issues. I proudly say that about 3 months into the pandemic, I had my COVID meltdown, because I had gone for 3 months straight, like many therapists, helping, and then I crashed.
Yeah.
Physician, heal thyself. Self-care is really important. So I needed to so I'm very much interested in working with leaders and HR individuals on creating their own awareness and by definition, then creating a better culture. That's one area. The other area that I'm passionate about and have done work with is work around trauma and first responders, military veterans and their families, and supporting them. So those are the two areas that I am now focusing on, in addition to the work that I do.
Yeah, and those are two areas where, you can start to change the world a little bit, Sam. And
hopefully.
Yeah, and like you say, biting off more than you can chew. But, so much of this is about that self-awareness step for leaders, for directors, for people in those positions, because to kind of build that self-awareness for them just opens up that whole perspective on, what you can actually achieve by creating these organizational cultures. And some of the significant challenges we've seen, especially here in the UK, and obviously, I try to take a global perspective, but some of the challenges we've had with businesses over the pandemic is a lack of self-awareness and leadership, which has led to organizational cultures falling apart as, companies have started to work remotely, and communication not being what it needs to be, and just the awareness to be able to, act with a little bit of humanity, a little bit of compassion, and a little bit of empathy for the collective human shared experience that we're having. And that literally is what binds, companies together and creates positive cultures. So I'm absolutely delighted to hear that, you're going to really be tackling that and smashing down some of those silos with a sledgehammer, Sam.
Yes, and I really think that there are many people in a position of leadership who are not doing that now, not because they're not interested, but they've never had to. And what the pandemic has done is has raised awareness around these issues, and now we're defining what the new workplace is going to look like. And I think, frankly, there are many HR individuals and leaders who are really thirsty to be doing this. So that's exciting as well.
Yeah, and it's really mirroring that passion that a lot of them have for people, for development, for making a difference, with the awareness of themselves and the ability to actually take action on that in a business or organizational space. So, Sam, it's been absolutely great to have you on. And, like you said, been waiting for so long. You're up nice and early out there in North America. But where can people find out more about your work, Sam?
You can look at my LinkedIn page. Just type in Sam Miller or Sam Miller Consulting. My website is sammillerconsulting.com. Those are the two best ways to reach out to me.
Yeah, and I'd recommend everybody to go and take a look. And, ultimately, Sam, I'm incredibly passionate about the work that you do. I really do in a lot of ways. I'm inspired when I see, the content that you post, and the fact that, you've constantly evolved, and especially how you've just taken this last year and really thought, what? I've been doing therapy for all this time, but I'm going to learn Zoom, WebEx, Teams. I'm going to just manage all that and actually start to look at the nuances of digital therapy and really start to work on those. So, it's been great to see that journey. And are there any parting thoughts that you'd like to leave for the audience, Sam?
Yes, it's been a difficult year. I think the world collectively has been through trauma, but I think, Lee, you're similar to me in both of us have a tremendous amount of hope for humanity. Human beings are resilient. We will get better. We will figure this out. And my perspective is that, and it's exciting to see. And the work that I've done with individuals over the year has just reaffirmed that. So I think a lot of positive is ahead.
Yeah, and that's a great way to, end this show. I mean, the Self-Aware Entrepreneur is here to really inspire those moments of optimism, really help with some actionable steps, and just sharing the journeys of people actually making a positive impact in the world. So Thank you for tuning in today. Thank you again to Sam for joining us, and we'll see you again